The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of London as thousands of tourists gathered outside Buckingham Palace. Among the crowd stood a man who looked different from the rest. His posture was straight, his eyes alert, and his movements carried the unmistakable precision of someone who had spent years in uniform. This was Jake Rodriguez, a decorated United States Marine who had seen action in 3 different countries and earned more medals than he cared to count. Jake wasn't supposed to be here as a tourist. He was in London on a special diplomatic exchange program, a rare opportunity for experienced military personnel to study foreign security protocols and build international relationships. After 15 years of service, most of it spent in combat zones where danger lurked around every corner, Jake found himself in an unusual position, wearing civilian clothes and trying to blend in with everyday people. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a man who had spent years protecting American interests abroad, now standing among chattering tourists with their cameras and guidebooks. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, asking when the guards would start marching. Elderly couples compared this moment to their previous visits decades ago. Young adults posed for selfies, hoping to capture the perfect shot for their social media accounts, but Jake's attention was focused elsewhere. His trained eyes automatically scanned the area, a habit so deeply ingrained that he couldn't turn it off even on his day off. He noticed the strategically placed security cameras, the subtle positioning of plainclothes officers among the crowd, and the carefully planned escape routes that most people would never think to observe. Old habits died hard, especially when those habits had kept him alive through some of the most dangerous situations imaginable. The crowd began to stir with excitement as the time for the changing of the guard ceremony approached. Jake had read about this tradition before arriving in London, but seeing it in person was something entirely different. The precision, the history, the weight of centuries-old tradition, it reminded him why he had fallen in love with military service in the first place. As the ceremony began, Jake watched with professional interest. The guards moved with mechanical precision, their red tunics bright against the gray London sky, their famous bearskin hats adding an extra foot to their already impressive height. Each step was measured, each movement calculated. It was a display of discipline that any military person could appreciate, regardless of which flag they served under. The crowd pressed closer, phones and cameras capturing every moment. Tour guides whispered explanations in multiple languages, sharing facts about the guards' uniforms, their weapons, and the history behind this daily ritual. Children pointed excitedly at the horses, while adults marveled at the guards' ability to remain completely motionless despite the chaos around them. Jake found himself studying the individual guards rather than the ceremony as a whole. His experience had taught him to read people, to notice the small details that others missed. In combat, those details could mean the difference between life and death. A slight change in posture might indicate fatigue. A barely noticeable shift in breathing could signal stress or injury. These skills had saved his life more times than he could count. That's when he noticed him, a young guard standing at attention, near the palace gates. At first glance, everything appeared normal. The guard's uniform was impeccable, his rifle held at the perfect angle, his expression appropriately stoic. But Jake's experienced eye caught something that sent a chill down his spine. There was a barely visible tremor in the guard's left hand, so slight that it would be invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. Jake stepped slightly to his right, trying to get a better view without drawing attention to himself. The movement allowed him to see the guard's face more clearly, and what he saw confirmed his growing concern. Beneath the shadow of the bearskin hat, the young man's complexion had taken on a pale, almost grayish tone. Tiny beads of sweat were visible on his forehead, despite the cool London morning. The guard's breathing, Jake noticed, was becoming increasingly shallow and rapid. His chest rose and fell in a pattern that Jake recognized from his medical training. Every Marine received basic first aid instruction, but Jake had gone further, earning certification as a combat medic early in his career. He had seen these symptoms before, in desert heat and humid jungles. In the aftermath of battles and during grueling training exercises, The young guard was in distress. Possibly serious distress, but his training and the weight of tradition kept him frozen in place. Jake understood this mentality completely. Military discipline often demanded that soldiers push through pain, discomfort, and even illness to complete their duties. The guard couldn't simply step out of formation or call for help, not in front of thousands of tourists. Not during one of Britain's most watched daily ceremonies. Jake's mind raced through possibilities. Heat exhaustion was likely, despite the moderate temperature, the heavy uniform, the bearskin hat, the pressure of standing perfectly still while thousands of eyes watched. It could overwhelm even a well-trained soldier. Or perhaps the guard was fighting off illness, forcing himself to perform his duty despite feeling unwell. Whatever the cause, Jake could see that the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The crowd around him continued their excited chatter, completely oblivious to the drama unfolding in front of them. Cameras clicked and whirred, capturing what everyone assumed was just another perfect performance by the Queen's Guard. Tour guides continued their rehearsed speeches about British military tradition and royal protocol. Parents pointed out details to their children, explaining the significance of the colorful ceremony, but Jake saw something else entirely. He saw a young soldier struggling to maintain his composure while his body began to fail him. He saw someone who was trained never to break, never to show weakness, never to let down his unit or his country. And most importantly, he saw someone who needed help. The guard's condition was clearly worsening. The tremor in his hand had spread to his arm, though he fought to control it. His breathing had become even more labored, and Jake could see him struggling to maintain his balance. The young man was fighting a battle against his own body, and he was losing. Jake felt the familiar weight of decision pressing down on him. His training screamed at him to act, to help a fellow serviceman in distress. The Marine Corps had drilled into him the sacred principle that you never abandon a brother in arms, regardless of circumstances. But another part of his mind, the part trained in diplomatic protocol and international relations, warned him about the potential consequences of interfering with a royal ceremony, standing there in his civilian clothes, surrounded by tourists who saw only pageantry and tradition. Jake found himself facing one of the most difficult decisions of his military career. The young guard's situation was becoming critical, and every second of hesitation could make the difference between a simple intervention and a medical emergency that could endanger not just the guard, but potentially others around him if he collapsed. The ceremony continued around them, beautiful and precise and utterly unaware of the crisis developing in its midst. And Jake stood there, his mind calculating distances and response times, his hands unconsciously clenching and unclenching, as he prepared himself for what he increasingly realized he would have to do. Jake's eyes remained locked on the struggling guard as the ceremony continued around them. What had started as a slight tremor was now becoming more obvious, at least to someone who knew what to look for. The young soldier was fighting a losing battle against his own body, and Jake could see all the telltale signs that most people would miss completely. Years of experience had taught Jake to read the human body like a book. In Afghanistan, he had learned to spot exhaustion in his fellow Marines before they even realized it themselves. In the scorching heat of Iraq, he had seen strong soldiers collapse without warning. During brutal training exercises in the swamps of North Carolina, he had watched as dehydration and heat stroke claimed even the toughest recruits. The signs were always the same, and they were all there in the young guard's deteriorating condition. The guard's breathing pattern was what worried Jake the most. It had shifted from controlled and steady to rapid and shallow. Jake counted the breaths. Too fast, much too fast. The young man was hyperventilating, though he was clearly trying to hide it. His chest moved quickly under the heavy red tunic, fighting for air while maintaining the rigid posture required by centuries of military tradition. Sweat was becoming more visible on the guard's forehead, despite the cool London morning. The temperature couldn't have been more than 60 degrees, hardly warm enough to cause this kind of reaction in a healthy person. But Jake knew that the heavy uniform, combined with the stress of performing in front of thousands of people, could create its own microclimate of heat and pressure. The thick wool tunic, the leather straps, the heavy bearskin hat, it all added up to a recipe for overheating. The crowd around Jake continued to enjoy the spectacle, completely unaware of the drama unfolding just yards away. A group of American tourists to his left were discussing their dinner plans for later that evening. Behind him, a family from Germany was trying to get their teenage daughter to pose for a photo with the guards in the background. Children ran between their parents' legs, excited by the colorful uniforms and the precision of the marching soldiers, but Jake's world had narrowed to focus on one person, the guard who was clearly in trouble. The young man's face had grown even paler, taking on an almost grayish tint that Jake recognized immediately. It was the color of someone whose body was struggling to maintain basic functions. Blood was being redirected away from the skin to vital organs, a natural response to stress or medical crisis. The guard's stance was beginning to waver slightly. To the casual observer, he still looked perfectly at attention, but Jake could see the minute adjustments the young man was making to keep himself upright. His weight was shifting almost imperceptibly from foot to foot, a sign that his body was struggling to maintain balance. Jake had seen this before. It was often the last warning sign before a complete collapse. What made the situation even more concerning was the guard's obvious determination to maintain his post. Military training runs deep, and Jake understood the mindset completely. The young soldier had been taught that his duty came before his personal comfort, before his own needs, even before his own safety in some circumstances. Breaking ranks during a public ceremony would be seen as a failure, a letting down of his unit and his country. So he stood there, fighting against his body's distress signals, willing himself to remain upright through sheer determination. Jake's medical training kicked into high gear as he continued his assessment. The rapid breathing, the pallor, the sweating, the struggle to maintain balance, it all pointed to a potentially serious medical situation. It could be heat exhaustion, even in the cool weather. It could be dehydration, made worse by the stress and physical demands of standing at attention for extended periods. There was even a possibility of something more serious, a medical condition that the guard might not even know he had. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Jake. Here he was, a foreign soldier watching one of Britain's most traditional ceremonies, and he was probably the only person in the crowd who could recognize what was happening. His fellow tourists were focused on getting the perfect photo or video to share with friends back home. The other guards, bound by their own discipline and focused on their own responsibilities, might not have noticed their colleagues' distress. Even the security personnel were scanning for external threats, not medical emergencies within their own ranks. Jake found himself moving slightly closer, drawn by an instinct he couldn't ignore. Every fiber of his military training told him that a soldier was in trouble, and soldiers don't abandon each other. It didn't matter that this young man wore a different uniform, served a different country, or followed different traditions. The bond between those who serve in uniform transcends borders and politics. A Marine's creed included the promise to never leave a fallen comrade behind. And Jake was beginning to see this as exactly that kind of situation. The guard's condition was deteriorating by the minute. Jake could now see a slight tremor in the young man's jaw, a sign that he was clenching his teeth to maintain control. His eyes, though fixed straight ahead as protocol demanded, had taken on a glassy quality that Jake recognized as a sign of impending medical crisis. The soldier was running on willpower alone now, and willpower had its limits. Jake began to calculate distances and response times in his head, another habit ingrained by years of military service. How far was he from the guard? Maybe 20 feet, certainly no more than 25. How long would it take him to cover that distance? 3 seconds, maybe 4 if he had to push through the crowd? How long before security would react to his movement? That was the unknown variable, and it was a big one. The weight of decision pressed down on Jake's shoulders like a physical force. He could see that the guard needed help, and he had the training and experience to provide that help. But he also understood the potential consequences of his actions. Interfering with a royal ceremony wouldn't just be embarrassing, it could create an international incident. He was in London as part of a diplomatic program, representing not just himself but the United States Marine Corps and his country, yet as Jake watched the young guard struggle to maintain his composure, all the diplomatic considerations began to fade into the background. This wasn't about politics or international relations or even military protocol. This was about one human being helping another. One soldier recognizing that a fellow soldier was in danger and needed assistance. The crowd pressed closer as the ceremony reached one of its climactic moments, everyone eager to capture the perfect shot or get the best view. The excitement and energy of thousands of people created its own pressure, and Jake could only imagine how that must feel to someone already struggling with a medical crisis. The noise, the movement, the constant flash of cameras, it all added to the stress that the young guard was already experiencing. Jake's hands unconsciously moved to check his pockets, an automatic response born of years of military readiness. He didn't have his full medical kit, of course, but he had the basics that any experienced soldier carries. More importantly, he had the knowledge and training to assess the situation properly and take appropriate action. The question was no longer whether the guard needed help. That was becoming increasingly obvious. The question was whether Jake would be able to live with himself if he stood by and watched while a fellow serviceman collapsed in front of thousands of people. The moment of decision arrived faster than Jake had expected. 1 second, the young guard was fighting to maintain his composure, and the next second Jake could see that the battle was almost lost. The soldier's knees gave a barely noticeable wobble, so slight that anyone else would have missed it completely. But to Jake's trained eye, it was like watching a building develop its first crack before a collapse. Jake's mind raced through a lifetime of military training and real-world experience. In boot camp at Parris Island, his drill instructors had hammered home one principle above all others: Marines don't leave Marines behind. That lesson had been reinforced in every training exercise, every deployment, every dangerous situation he had ever faced. It didn't matter if you were tired, scared, or facing overwhelming odds. When a fellow Marine needed help, you acted without hesitation, but this wasn't a fellow Marine. This was a British soldier serving his own country under his own flag. Jake was a guest in this country, here on a diplomatic mission that could be jeopardized by a single wrong move. The rational part of his mind, the part trained in international relations and cultural sensitivity, screamed warnings about the potential consequences of interfering with a centuries-old royal tradition. Yet as Jake watched the guard's condition deteriorate by the second, all those considerations began to seem less important than the fundamental human drama playing out in front of him. Military uniforms might be different colors, flags might bear different symbols, and nations might have different traditions, but the bond between soldiers transcended all of those surface differences. A soldier in distress was a soldier in distress, regardless of nationality. The crowd around Jake continued their excited chatter, completely absorbed in the pageantry and tradition of the ceremony. A middle-aged woman next to him was explaining to her husband how the guards' uniforms had remained unchanged for hundreds of years. Behind him, a group of college students were debating whether the rifles the guards carried were actually loaded. Children pointed and whispered about the tall, furry hats that made the soldiers look like giants. None of them saw what Jake saw. None of them recognized the signs of impending medical crisis. To them, the guards were like living statues, perfect examples of military discipline and British tradition. The idea that one of these seemingly invincible figures might be human, enough to suffer from illness or exhaustion, simply didn't occur to them. Jake took a small step forward, testing the crowd's reaction and his own resolve. The movement felt natural, as if he was simply trying to get a better view of the ceremony like any other tourist. But in his mind, that single step represented a point of no return. He was no longer just an observer. He was positioning himself to act if the situation demanded it. The guard's breathing had become even more labored, though he was fighting desperately to hide it. Jake could see the young man's chest rising and falling rapidly under his heavy red tunic. Sweat was now clearly visible on his forehead, despite the cool London morning. and his face had taken on an alarming grayish pallor that Jake had seen too many times before in soldiers, pushed beyond their limits. What worried Jake most was the guard's eyes. Though they remained fixed straight ahead as protocol required, they had developed a glassy, unfocused quality that signaled the beginning of a serious medical episode. The young soldier was still conscious and still trying to perform his duty, but his body was starting to shut down non-essential functions to preserve vital organs. Jake's military training kicked into overdrive as he began to formulate a plan. If he was going to act, he needed to do it in a way that would minimize disruption to the ceremony while maximizing his ability to help the struggling guard. He couldn't just charge through the crowd like he was storming a battlefield. This required finesse, timing, and a deep understanding of both military protocol and human psychology. The irony of the situation struck Jake with full force. Here he was, a combat veteran who had faced enemy fire in 3 different countries, and he was more nervous about approaching a ceremonial guard in peaceful London than he had been during any firefight. The stakes felt impossibly high, not because of physical danger, but because of the potential diplomatic and professional consequences of his actions. But then Jake remembered something his first squad leader had told him during his early days as a Marine. "Rodriguez," the grizzled sergeant had said, "there's going to come a time when you have to choose between following orders and doing what's right. When that time comes, you better make sure you can live with whatever choice you make." At the time, Jake had thought the sergeant was talking about combat situations, moments when split-second decisions could mean the difference between life and death for himself and his fellow Marines. He had never imagined that the most difficult application of that lesson would come during a tourist visit to Buckingham Palace. Watching a ceremonial guard struggle against his own body's limitations, the guard's knees wobbled again, more noticeably. This time, Jake saw the young man's jaw clench as he fought to maintain his rigid posture, but the effort was clearly taking everything he had left. The soldier was running on pure willpower now, and willpower alone couldn't overcome the body's physical limitations indefinitely. Jake made his decision. It wasn't a dramatic moment of revelation or a sudden burst of courage. It was more like a switch being flipped in his mind, the same mental process that had carried him through countless dangerous situations during his military career. The analysis was complete, the options had been weighed, and the correct course of action was clear. Everything else was just execution. He began moving through the crowd with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years navigating chaotic situations. Jake didn't push or shove, but he moved with purpose and authority that caused people to step aside almost unconsciously. His bearing and demeanor radiated the kind of confidence that made others assume he belonged wherever he was going. The security barriers that separated the crowd from the ceremony area suddenly seemed much more significant. What had looked like simple crowd control measures from a distance now appeared as formidable obstacles that could complicate his approach. Jake's mind automatically calculated the best route to the struggling guard while minimizing his exposure to security personnel who might see his movement as a threat. As he moved closer to the barrier, Jake could hear the ceremonial commands being shouted by the officers directing the guard change. The precision and timing of the ceremony continued unchanged, a testament to centuries of military tradition and the professionalism of the soldiers involved. But Jake's focus remained entirely on the one guard whose participation in that tradition was becoming increasingly tenuous. The young soldier was now visibly swaying, though he was still fighting to hide it. Jake could see the tremendous effort it was taking for the guard to remain upright, and he knew from experience that this kind of physical distress could escalate rapidly from manageable to life-threatening. There was no more time for hesitation. Guessing. Jake reached the barrier and paused for just a moment, making one final assessment of the situation. The guard was less than 20 feet away now, close enough that Jake could see the strain etched on his face despite his efforts to maintain a stoic expression. Security personnel were visible, but positioned to watch for external threats, not for someone moving to help one of their own guards. Taking a deep breath, Jake placed his hands on the barrier and prepared to step over it. Everything he had learned about duty, honor, and the bonds between soldiers had led to this moment. There was no going back now. Jake stepped over the barrier with the fluid motion of someone who had spent years moving through restricted areas. His movements were deliberate but not rushed, confident but not aggressive. Years of military training had taught him how to project authority while avoiding the appearance of threat, and he needed every bit of that skill now. The moment his feet touched the ceremonial ground, Jake felt the weight of hundreds of years of tradition beneath his shoes. This was sacred space in its own way, ground that had been walked by generations of British soldiers, witnessed by countless monarchs, and preserved as a symbol of national pride. Every step he took was a violation of protocol, but it was also a step toward helping someone who desperately needed assistance. The struggling guard was now only 15 feet away, and Jake could see that the young man's condition had deteriorated even further in the few seconds it had taken to cross the barrier. The soldier's breathing was rapid and shallow. His face had taken on an alarming grayish color, and tiny beads of sweat were visible on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Most concerning of all, the guard's eyes had developed a glassy, unfocused quality that Jake recognized as a sign of impending collapse. Jake's approach was noticed immediately by some members of the crowd. Cameras swung in his direction, and excited whispers began to ripple through the gathered tourists. Children pointed at the man in civilian clothes walking toward the guards, and parents began snapping photos of what they assumed was some unexpected part of the ceremony. The irony wasn't lost on Jake. These people thought they were witnessing planned entertainment, when they were actually watching an emergency unfold. As Jake drew closer to the struggling guard, he began speaking in low, measured tones. His voice carried the authority and calmness that comes from years of military leadership, designed to cut through confusion and panic with clear, simple communication. "Easy there, soldier," he said quietly. "Just loud enough for the guard to hear, but not loud enough to disrupt the ceremony around them. I can see you're having trouble. I'm here to help." The guard's eyes flickered slightly, a brief acknowledgement that he had heard Jake's words, though his training kept him from responding directly. Jake could see the conflict playing out on the young man's face, relief that someone had recognized his distress, but also concern about breaking protocol and potentially embarrassing himself and his unit in front of thousands of spectators. Jake positioned himself carefully, using his body to partially shield the guard from the view of cameras and curious onlookers. His movements were subtle but strategic, designed to preserve the young soldier's dignity while providing the support he desperately needed. "You're doing great," Jake continued in the same calm tone. "Just focus on staying upright. I've got you covered." The guard's knees gave another wobble, more pronounced this time, and Jake instinctively moved closer. His military instincts were in full control now, reading the situation and responding with the kind of split-second decision-making that had kept him alive through multiple combat deployments. The young soldier was moments away from collapse, and Jake positioned himself to provide support if needed. "Listen to me," Jake said, his voice taking on the tone he had used countless times to reassure wounded Marines in combat situations. "You're experiencing what we call heat exhaustion, probably made worse by stress and that heavy uniform. Your body is working overtime to keep you functioning, but it needs help. Just lean back slightly. I'll catch you if you need me to." The guard's professional training warred with his body's physical limitations. Jake could see the tremendous effort it was taking for the young man to remain at attention, fighting against every instinct that told him to sit down, to remove his heavy hat, to seek relief from the mounting pressure. But centuries of military tradition and the weight of representing his country in front of an international audience kept him locked in position. Jake's medical training kicked into high gear as he assessed the guard's condition more closely. The rapid breathing, excessive sweating, pale complexion, and obvious struggle to maintain balance all pointed to a potentially serious situation that could escalate quickly without intervention. He had seen similar cases during training exercises in hot climates, and he knew that what started as simple exhaustion could rapidly progress to something much more dangerous. "I know you can't respond directly," Jake continued, maintaining his calm, steady tone. "But I need you to know that I understand your situation. I'm a United States Marine, and I've been where you are right now. There's no shame in needing help. The shame would be in not accepting it when it's offered." The crowd around them had grown more animated as people realized something unusual was happening. Tour guides were trying to explain what they were seeing, though most had no idea themselves. Some spectators assumed Jake was part of the ceremony, perhaps representing international military cooperation. Others began to sense that something was wrong, though they couldn't quite identify what it was. Jake could hear the change in the crowd's energy, the shift from routine tourist excitement to genuine curiosity and concern. Cameras that had been focused on the marching guards were now pointed in his direction, capturing every moment of his interaction with the struggling soldier. He knew that whatever happened next would likely be shared around the world within hours, but that concern seemed insignificant compared to the immediate need to help. Someone in distress, the guard's condition was becoming critical. Jake could see that the young man was now swaying more noticeably, though he was still fighting to hide it. His jaw was clenched with effort, and his hands showed a barely visible tremor that indicated his body's struggle to maintain basic functions. The soldier was running purely on willpower and military discipline, but both had their limits. "Oh, okay. Here's what we're going to do," Jake said, moving even closer to the guard while maintaining the appearance of casual observation for the benefit of the watching crowd. "I'm going to position myself right behind you, close enough to provide support if you need it. You don't have to acknowledge me or break your position, just know that I'm here. If you feel yourself starting to fall, just lean back slightly and I'll catch you." The guard's breathing had become even more labored, and Jake could see that the young man was fighting a losing battle against his body's physical limitations. Sweat was now clearly visible on his forehead and beginning to trickle down his face despite the moderate temperature and light breeze. His complexion had taken on an alarming pallor that Jake had seen too many times before in soldiers pushed beyond their endurance. Jake made a subtle adjustment to his position, moving close enough to provide immediate support while trying to remain as inconspicuous as possible. His presence near the guard was now obvious to anyone watching closely, but he hoped that his calm demeanor and respectful approach would be interpreted as assistance rather than interference. Every instinct told him that the situation was about to reach a crisis point, and he needed to be ready to act immediately when it did. The young soldier's legs gave another wobble, more pronounced this time, and Jake saw the moment when the guard's iron discipline finally began to crack under the strain of physical distress. The young man's eyes widened slightly in what Jake recognized as the first sign of panic. The moment when a soldier realizes that willpower alone might not be enough to complete the mission. "I've got you," Jake whispered, positioning himself to provide support the instant it became necessary. "You're not alone in this." The moment Jake had been preparing for arrived without warning. 1 second, the young guard was fighting to maintain his position, and the next second his knees buckled completely. Jake's reflexes, honed by years of combat experience, kicked in instantly. He caught the falling soldier with smooth precision, supporting his weight while keeping him upright, enough to maintain some dignity in front of the watching crowd. The guard's collapse wasn't dramatic or theatrical like something from a movie. It was the quiet, almost gentle surrender of a body that had simply reached its absolute limit. The young man's legs gave out, his carefully maintained posture crumpled, and for a brief moment his eyes rolled back as his consciousness flickered. Jake felt the full weight of the soldier's body against his arms, along with the surprising heaviness of the ceremonial uniform and equipment. "I've got you, brother," Jake whispered, using the universal term that soldiers worldwide understood regardless of nationality or language barriers. His voice carried the calm authority of someone who had been in similar situations before, someone who knew exactly what to do when everything went wrong. "Just breathe easy, you're safe now." The crowd's reaction was immediate and electric. "What?" had been polite tourist murmuring exploded into gasps, excited chatter, and the rapid clicking of camera shutters. Children pointed and asked their parents what was happening. Elderly visitors strained to get a better view of the unexpected drama unfolding before their eyes. Tour guides found themselves at a loss for words, their prepared speeches suddenly irrelevant to the real-life emergency they were witnessing. But Jake's world had narrowed to focus entirely on the guard in his arms. The young man was conscious, but barely, his breathing rapid and shallow, his skin pale and clammy to the touch. Jake could feel the soldier's heart racing through his heavy uniform, and he knew from experience that they were dealing with a serious medical situation that could escalate quickly without proper intervention. The weight of centuries-old protocol seemed to hang in the air around them. Jake was acutely aware that he was supporting a member of the Queen's Guard during one of Britain's most sacred military ceremonies. Every tourist camera was now pointed in their direction, capturing images that would likely be shared around the world within minutes. The diplomatic implications of his actions were staggering, but those concerns felt distant compared to the immediate need to help someone in distress. Security personnel had noticed the disruption almost immediately. From his peripheral vision, Jake could see uniformed officers moving in their direction, their faces showing the professional alertness that comes with years of protecting high-profile events. Their movements were measured but purposeful, indicating that they were treating this as a potential security incident rather than a medical emergency. The guard Jake was supporting made a weak attempt to stand on his own military pride still, driving him to try to complete his duties despite his body's obvious distress. "Easy there," Jake said gently, maintaining his supportive grip while allowing the young man to regain some composure. "No rush, let your body catch up before you. Try to stand." Jake's medical training automatically kicked in as he continued to assess the guard's condition. The soldier's pulse was rapid but steady. His breathing was improving slightly now that he wasn't fighting to maintain rigid posture, and his color was beginning to return slowly. These were all positive signs, but Jake knew that heat exhaustion could be unpredictable and that the young man needed proper medical attention as soon as possible. The approaching security officers were now close, enough that Jake could see their faces clearly. They moved with the controlled urgency of professionals who dealt with unexpected situations regularly. But Jake could tell from their expressions that they weren't quite sure how to categorize what they were seeing. A tourist helping a guard wasn't exactly covered in their standard protocol manual. "Sir, step away from the guard immediately," came the first official command, delivered in the crisp, authoritative tone that police officers worldwide use to establish control over chaotic situations. The voice belonged to a Metropolitan Police officer whose hand was already moving toward his radio to call for backup. The seriousness of the situation was escalating rapidly. Jake looked up at the approaching officers while maintaining his supportive grip on the struggling guard. "This soldier is experiencing a medical emergency," he said clearly, using the calm, professional tone he had learned during his own military service. "I'm a United States Marine with medical training, and he needs immediate assistance." The lead officer paused for just a moment, processing this information while trying to assess whether Jake represented a threat or was genuinely trying to help. The tension was visible on his face as he balanced the need to secure the scene against the obvious medical crisis unfolding before him. Behind him, additional security personnel were arriving, their radios crackling with rapid communications. More guards from the ceremony had begun to take notice of the commotion, though their training kept most of them focused on their own duties. However, Jake could see concerned glances being exchanged between soldiers who understood better than anyone else what their colleague was experiencing. Military personnel worldwide shared an unspoken bond, and seeing one of their own in distress affected them all. The crowd had grown significantly larger as word of the incident spread through the tourist area. People were pressing closer to get a better view, creating additional pressure on the security personnel who now had to manage both the immediate medical situation and the growing crowd of onlookers. Camera phones held high captured every moment, ensuring that this incident would be documented from multiple angles. Jake could feel the guard beginning to regain some strength, though the young man was still heavily dependent on his support. "How are you feeling?" Jake asked quietly, keeping his voice low enough that only the soldier could hear. The guard managed a slight nod, indicating that he was alert and responsive, which was encouraging given how close he had come to complete collapse. The security response was now in full swing. Additional officers had formed a perimeter around the area, keeping the growing crowd at a safe distance while allowing medical personnel clear access to the scene. Jake could hear radio chatter discussing ambulance response times and coordination with Palace medical staff. The machinery of emergency response was moving efficiently, but Jake knew that every second counted in situations like this. "Sir, we need you to release the guard and step back now," came another command, this time from what appeared to be a senior security official whose uniform indicated significant authority. His tone was firm but not hostile, suggesting that he understood Jake's intentions while still needing to regain control of the situation. Jake looked down at the guard he was supporting, whose condition had stabilized somewhat but who was clearly still in need of medical attention. "Can you stand on your own?" he asked quietly. The young soldier gave a weak but determined nod, and Jake could feel him trying to gather the strength to support his own weight again. The moment of transition arrived as carefully as Jake could manage it. He gradually reduced his support while remaining close enough to provide assistance if needed, allowing the guard to demonstrate that he could stand independently while ensuring that help was immediately available if his condition deteriorated again. The young soldier managed to straighten somewhat, though he was clearly still struggling with the effects of his medical episode. Palace medical personnel arrived on the scene with professional efficiency, carrying equipment and moving with the practiced ease of people who had dealt with similar situations before. Their presence shifted the dynamic immediately, transforming what had been a security incident back into a medical emergency with appropriate professional response. The situation changed in an instant. What had been a careful medical intervention suddenly became a full-scale security operation as more officers arrived on the scene. Jake found himself surrounded by at least 6 uniformed personnel, their faces showing the heightened alertness that comes with protecting one of the world's most high-profile locations. The peaceful morning ceremony had transformed into something that looked more like a crime scene. "Sir, place your hands behind your back," came the firm command from the lead security officer. His voice carried the weight of absolute authority, the kind of tone that expected immediate compliance without question or debate. Jake could see the tension in the officer's posture, the way his hand hovered near his equipment, ready to respond to any sign of resistance or threat. Jake slowly raised his hands, moving with deliberate care to avoid any action that might be misinterpreted as aggressive. Years of military training had taught him how to de-escalate tense situations through body language and tone of voice. "I understand your concerns," he said calmly, making eye contact with the lead officer. "I'm going to comply fully with your instructions." The guard is stable now, but he still needs medical attention. The handcuffs were applied with professional efficiency, neither roughly nor gently, but with the practiced motion of officers who had done this countless times before. Jake felt the cold metal against his wrists and heard the distinctive clicking sound as they locked into place. Despite his cooperation and the obvious medical nature of his intervention, protocol demanded that he be secured until the situation could be fully assessed. Behind him, Palace medical personnel had taken over care of the struggling guard. Jake could hear them conducting their own assessment, checking vital signs and asking quiet questions about the young man's condition. Their voices carried the calm professionalism of people trained to handle medical emergencies, and Jake felt a sense of relief knowing that the guard was now receiving proper care from qualified medical staff. The crowd's reaction to Jake's detention was immediate and dramatic. Gasps rippled through the gathered tourists as they watched a man who had clearly been helping someone get arrested by police. Children asked their parents why the nice man was being put in handcuffs. Camera phones captured every moment, and Jake knew that images of his arrest would be circulating on social media within minutes. "This is a misunderstanding," called out a voice from the crowd. An elderly American tourist was addressing the officers, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. That man was helping the guard who was clearly in trouble. We all saw what happened. Other voices joined in, creating a chorus of support for Jake's actions that seemed to surprise the security personnel. The lead officer's radio crackled too. Life with updates from command personnel who were trying to piece together exactly what had occurred. Jake could hear fragments of the communication, references to video footage being reviewed, discussions about diplomatic protocols and requests for additional information about his identity and background. The machinery of security investigation was moving quickly to understand the situation. Jake was guided away from the immediate scene with firm but not aggressive handling. The officers maintained professional distance while ensuring he remained secure, their training evident in how they managed both his detention and the growing crowd of concerned onlookers. Every movement was calculated to maintain control while avoiding any appearance of excessive force that might further inflame the situation. As they moved, Jake caught glimpses of the ongoing medical response. The young guard was now sitting on a portable medical chair, his heavy bearskin hat removed, and his uniform loosened to help with circulation and cooling. Medical personnel were checking his blood pressure and pulse while asking questions about his symptoms. The soldier appeared alert and responsive, which was encouraging given how close he had come to complete collapse. The walk to the security office felt like a journey through multiple worlds. Behind them, the ceremony was somehow continuing with military precision despite the disruption, testament to the professionalism of the remaining guards who maintained their duties even as their colleague received medical care. Around them, tourists continued to gather and point. Many still unclear about what they had witnessed, but certain it was something extraordinary. Jake's mind was already working through the potential consequences of his actions. As a Marine participating in a diplomatic exchange program, his conduct reflected not just on himself but on the United States military and the broader relationship between allied nations. The political implications of an American serviceman being arrested during a royal ceremony could extend far beyond this morning's incident. The security office was a stark contrast to the ceremonial grandeur outside. Functional furniture, monitoring equipment, and communication devices filled the space with the efficient atmosphere of a working command center. Officers moved with purpose, coordinating responses and gathering information while maintaining the constant vigilance required to protect such a high-profile location. Sergeant Rodriguez, United States Marine Corps, Jake said clearly when asked to identify himself, providing his military identification along with his diplomatic credentials. He knew that cooperation and transparency were his best options for resolving the situation quickly and minimizing any international complications that might arise from his detention. The questioning began immediately, though it was conducted with the professional courtesy typically shown to foreign military personnel. Officers wanted to know about his background, his training, his reasons for being at the ceremony, and most importantly, his motivations for intervening when he did. Jake answered each question honestly and completely, explaining his medical training and his assessment of the guard's condition. Outside the office, Jake could hear the ongoing activity as the situation continued to unfold. Radio communications provided updates about the guard's improving condition, the crowd's gradual dispersal, and the coordination with various government agencies who needed to be informed about the incident. The complexity of managing such an event was becoming clear even from his limited perspective. The diplomatic credentials Jake carried proved crucial in establishing his legitimate presence in the country and his official status as a guest of the British military. Phone calls were made to confirm his identity and his participation in the exchange program, adding credibility to his account of events and helping to frame his actions in the proper context. As the initial questioning continued, Jake found himself reflecting on the split-second decision that had led to this moment. Given the same circumstances, he knew he would make the same choice again. Military training and personal values had combined to make intervention inevitable once he recognized that someone needed help. The consequences, whatever they might be, were secondary to the fundamental obligation to assist a fellow serviceman. In distress, the atmosphere in the security office began to shift slightly as more information became available about Jake's background and the guard's condition. Officers who had initially treated him as a potential security threat were beginning to understand that they were dealing with a trained professional who had responded appropriately to a medical emergency. The handcuffs remained in place, but the tension in the room was gradually diminishing. Medical updates confirmed that the guard was recovering well from his episode, with no signs of serious complications or long-term effects. The young soldier had been moved to a more comfortable medical facility within the palace complex where he could rest and recover under proper supervision. His condition was stable, and he was expected to make a full recovery within a few hours. The investigation was expanding to include review of security camera footage that had captured the entire incident from multiple angles. This evidence would provide an objective record of Jake's actions and motivations, potentially supporting his account of events and demonstrating the medical nature of his intervention. The visual evidence would be crucial in determining how to proceed with his case. The security footage changed everything. Jake watched from his chair in the investigation room as 3 different camera angles played simultaneously on the monitors in front of him. The high-definition video captured every detail of the morning's events with crystal clarity, providing an objective record that spoke louder than any testimony could. The first camera angle showed Jake in the crowd, his body language and facial expressions clearly visible as he noticed the guard's distress. Even in silence, the footage told a compelling story. Investigators could see the exact moment when Jake's casual tourist demeanor shifted to focused concern, the way his posture straightened and his attention locked onto the struggling soldier. There was no mistaking the genuine worry on his face. The second camera captured Jake's careful approach through the crowd and over the barrier. The footage showed his deliberate, non-threatening movements, the way he positioned himself to help rather than to cause harm. Investigators could see how he spoke to the guard, his body language radiating calm authority rather than aggression or malice. Every gesture reinforced his claim that this had been a medical intervention, not a security breach. The third angle provided the most dramatic footage, the moment when the guard's knees buckled and Jake caught him. The video showed the smooth, practiced way Jake supported the falling soldier, preventing what could have been a dangerous collapse onto the hard pavement. Without sound, the footage still conveyed the care and professionalism with which Jake had handled the crisis. Detective Inspector Williams, who had taken over the investigation, paused the video at the moment of Jake's intervention. "This footage supports everything you've told us," he said, his tone notably different from the harsh commands that had marked Jake's initial detention. "We can clearly see that the guard was in serious distress and that your response was entirely appropriate for the situation." Jake nodded, feeling a wave of relief wash over him as the evidence vindicated his actions. "I've been in similar situations during my military service," he explained. "When you see a fellow soldier in trouble, you don't think about protocol or consequences. You just act on your training and try to help." The investigation room had gradually filled with additional personnel as the incident gained attention at higher levels of government and military command. Jake could see representatives from the American Embassy, British military liaisons, and what appeared to be senior palace security officials. The simple medical emergency had evolved into a diplomatic situation that required careful handling from multiple agencies. Phone calls were being made to verify Jake's credentials and his participation in the military exchange program. The conversations were conducted in hushed tones, but Jake could catch fragments that indicated his superiors in the Marine Corps were being briefed about the situation. His commanding officer would need to be informed, and depending on how this was handled, it could affect his military career and future assignments. The young guard Jake had helped was also being interviewed about the morning's events. Through the open door of an adjacent room, Jake could see the soldiers speaking with medical personnel and investigators. The guard appeared much better than he had during the ceremony. His color had returned to normal, and he was sitting upright without assistance. Seeing his recovery was deeply satisfying for Jake, confirming that his intervention had been both necessary and successful. Dr. Patricia Hayes, the palace physician who had examined the guard, entered the investigation room carrying a medical report. The young man you assisted was indeed experiencing heat exhaustion complicated by dehydration and stress, she reported to the assembled investigators. His condition could have escalated to heat stroke if he had collapsed and remained in the sun. Your intervention likely prevented a much more serious medical emergency. The medical assessment provided crucial context for understanding the morning's events. What had appeared to be a disruption of ceremonial protocol was revealed to be a legitimate medical emergency that required immediate intervention. Jake's actions were not only justified but potentially life-saving, transforming the narrative from security breach to heroic assistance. Major Thompson from the British Army's Household Division arrived to provide military perspective on the incident. As someone responsible for the training and welfare of the ceremonial guards, his input carried significant weight in determining how the situation should be resolved. Our guards are trained to maintain their positions under difficult circumstances, he explained, but they're also human beings who can experience medical emergencies. We appreciate when fellow soldiers recognize distress and provide assistance. The investigation revealed additional details about the guard's condition that morning. The young soldier, Private Collins, had been fighting a minor illness for several days but hadn't reported it because he didn't want to miss his ceremonial duties. The combination of the heavy uniform, the stress of performing in front of thousands of people, and his underlying condition had created a perfect storm for a medical crisis. Jake learned that Private Collins had specifically requested to thank him personally for his assistance. The young guard understood that Jake had put his own position at risk to help someone he didn't even know, and he wanted to express his gratitude directly. This request carried significant weight with the investigators, as it demonstrated that even the supposed victim of Jake's interference viewed his actions as helpful rather than harmful. The diplomatic implications of the incident were being carefully managed by representatives from both governments. The American embassy wanted to ensure that Jake's actions were properly understood and that any negative consequences were minimized. The British authorities needed to balance security concerns with recognition of genuine assistance provided to one of their soldiers. Both sides seemed committed to finding a resolution that honored Jake's good intentions. Security camera footage from earlier in the morning was also reviewed to establish a complete timeline of events. This additional evidence showed Jake behaving normally as a tourist before the ceremony began, further supporting his claim that the intervention was spontaneous rather than planned. There was no indication of any advanced preparation or coordination that might suggest ulterior motives. The investigation expanded to include interviews with other tourists who had witnessed the events. These civilian witnesses universally supported Jake's account, describing how they had seen him help the guard who was clearly in trouble. Several tourists had captured their own video footage on personal devices, and this additional evidence further corroborated the official security recordings. As more information became available, the tone of the investigation shifted noticeably. What had begun as a potential security incident was increasingly being viewed as an example of international military cooperation and human compassion. Jake's actions were being reframed from interference to assistance, from protocol violation to emergency response. The handcuffs that had restrained Jake for the past hour were finally removed as investigators concluded their initial assessment. The physical symbol of his detention was gone, but the formal investigation would continue as various agencies worked to document the incident and determine the appropriate official response. Jake rubbed his wrists, grateful for the return of basic freedom of movement. Colonel Davidson, Jake's superior officer in the exchange program, arrived at the palace to provide support and represent American military interests in the ongoing discussions. His presence added another layer of legitimacy to Jake's position and demonstrated that the U.S. military stood behind his actions. The colonel's first words to Jake were simple but meaningful. "You did the right thing, Marine." The investigation was nearing its conclusion as all the evidence pointed to the same conclusion. Jake had responded appropriately to a legitimate medical emergency, putting the welfare of a fellow soldier above his own concerns about protocol or consequences. The challenge now was determining how to officially recognize his actions, while maintaining the dignity and security of the royal ceremony. The formal resolution came 3 hours after Jake's initial detention, but the emotional weight of those hours felt like days. Inspector Williams returned to the investigation room carrying a folder thick with witness statements, medical reports, and official correspondence. His expression had transformed completely from the stern authority figure who had overseen Jake's arrest to someone who clearly respected what had unfolded that morning. "Mr. Rodriguez," Williams began, using Jake's civilian title rather than his military rank, "after a thorough investigation involving multiple agencies, security footage analysis, witness interviews, and medical assessment, we have concluded that your actions this morning were entirely justified and appropriate. You are being released immediately with no charges filed." Jake felt a profound sense of relief wash over him, though he tried to maintain the composed demeanor expected of a Marine. The official vindication meant everything, not just for his own peace of mind, but for his military career and the diplomatic program he represented. "Thank you, sir," he replied simply. "I'm just glad Private Collins is okay." The mention of the young guard brought smiles to several faces in the room. Collins had made a complete recovery and was resting comfortably in the Palace Medical Facility. His vital signs had returned to normal, his color was healthy again, and he was already asking when he could return to duty. The quick recovery reinforced the medical team's assessment that Jake's intervention had prevented a much more serious situation. Colonel Davidson stepped forward, his pride in his Marine evident in his expression and posture. "Jake, what you did out there today exemplified everything we try to teach about leadership, courage, and putting others before yourself. You saw someone in trouble and you acted despite the personal risk and potential consequences. That's what Marines do." The colonel's words carried special weight because they came from someone who had served in combat alongside Marines for over 20 years. He had seen courage under fire, split-second decisions in life-or-death situations, and the kind of character that defined the best military personnel. His endorsement of Jake's actions was both professional validation and personal recognition. Major Thompson from the British Army had remained throughout the investigation, and now he approached Jake with an expression of genuine gratitude. "On behalf of the Household Division and Private Collins personally, I want to thank you for your assistance this morning. Your actions demonstrated the best qualities of military service, the willingness to help a fellow soldier regardless of nationality or uniform." The Major's words highlighted something that had become clear throughout the investigation. This incident had strengthened rather than strained the relationship between American and British military personnel. What could have been a diplomatic embarrassment had instead become an example of international military cooperation and the universal bonds that connect soldiers worldwide. Private Collins himself appeared in the doorway, looking remarkably better than he had just hours earlier. The young guard had insisted on coming to thank Jake personally, despite medical advice to rest longer. His appearance brought a hush to the room as everyone recognized the significance of this moment, the meeting between the man who had needed help and the man who had provided it. "Sir," Collins said, addressing Jake with the formal respect, "one soldier shows another. I wanted to thank you personally for what you did today. I know you put yourself at risk to help me, and I'll never forget that kindness." His voice carried the sincerity of someone who truly understood the sacrifice Jake had made on his behalf. Jake stood and shook the young guard's hand, a simple gesture that seemed to carry profound meaning for everyone watching. "Any soldier would have done the same thing," Jake replied, though everyone in the room knew that wasn't entirely true. Not everyone would have recognized the signs of distress. Not everyone would have been willing to risk international incident to help a stranger, and not everyone would have possessed the medical knowledge to intervene effectively. The handshake between the two soldiers became a symbol of something larger than the morning's events. It represented the bonds that connect military personnel across national boundaries, the commitment to help fellow soldiers in need, and the human compassion that transcends political differences and ceremonial protocols. Dr. Hayes provided a final medical update that put the morning's events into clear perspective. Private Collins experienced what we classify as moderate heat exhaustion, complicated by dehydration and stress. Without intervention, his condition could have progressed to heat stroke, which can be life-threatening. The immediate support he received prevented a medical emergency from becoming a medical crisis. The doctor's assessment provided the scientific foundation for what everyone already understood emotionally. Jake's actions had quite possibly saved a life. The medical terminology gave weight to the human drama that had unfolded, transforming a story of military compassion into documented evidence of effective emergency response. News of the incident had begun to spread beyond the official channels, with social media posts from tourists who had witnessed the events. The initial confusion about what had happened was giving way to accurate accounts that portrayed Jake as a hero rather than a troublemaker. Videos captured by tourist phones were being shared with captions praising the American Marine who had helped a British guard in distress. The palace press office was already preparing a statement that would frame the incident in positive terms, emphasizing the international cooperation and human compassion demonstrated by Jake's actions. Rather than trying to minimize or hide what had happened, the official response would celebrate it as an example of the values shared by Allied military forces. Inspector Williams presented Jake with a formal letter documenting the investigation's conclusions and his complete exoneration. The document would be important for Jake's military record and any future security clearances, providing official confirmation that his actions had been appropriate and commendable rather than problematic or concerning. As the formal proceedings concluded, Jake found himself surrounded by people who had initially viewed him as a potential security threat, but now saw him as someone worthy of respect and admiration. The transformation in their attitudes reflected the power of truth and evidence to overcome initial misunderstandings and suspicions. The story would become legend within military circles on both sides of the Atlantic. It would be told in training academies as an example of how to recognize medical emergencies and respond appropriately under pressure. It would be shared in diplomatic circles as evidence of the strong bonds between allied nations. Most importantly, it would be remembered as a reminder that the obligation to help fellow soldiers transcends all other considerations. Jake's final act before leaving the palace was to visit Private Collins one more time in the medical facility. The two soldiers spent a few minutes talking about their respective military experiences, their training, and their shared understanding of what it meant to serve in uniform. It was a conversation between professionals who had been brought together by extraordinary circumstances but connected by ordinary human decency. Walking out of Buckingham Palace that afternoon, Jake reflected on how a simple tourist visit had become one of the most significant experiences of his military career. He had acted on instinct and training, following principles drilled into him over years of service. The consequences had been far greater than he could have imagined, but he knew without doubt that he would make the same choice again if faced with similar circumstances. The morning's events would be remembered not as a security incident or diplomatic complication, but as a powerful reminder that the best qualities of military service, courage, compassion, and commitment to helping others, know no national boundaries and recognize no flags, except the universal banner of human decency.